is Semeiosis and Intentionality by T.L. Short in the Transactions of the Charles S. Peirce Society for Semiotics. Okay, here we go. And it's a little long, so I may try to read fast. I shouldn't have done this, but we're going to do it anyway. It's my whole life. Why did I do this? I don't know. Semiosis and Intentionality. In this essay, I propose a new interpretation of some of the basic ideas in Peirce's Semiotic or theory of signs. My aim is to make a case for Peirce's theory as being 1. Coherent, 2. Intellectually fruitful, and on the evidence of 1 and 2, 3. It's true. Alright, so section 1, Semiotic as a science. Peirce meant semiotic to be a science of sign phenomena. But no science is restricted to an arbitrary or merely conventional grouping of phenomena. The aim is to cut nature at nature's joints. Only so could the resulting conceptual scheme be illuminating and fruitful. Therefore, Peirce can neither rely uncritically on the ordinary usage of the word sign, nor depart from the ordinary usage in an arbitrary manner. If the question were simply what we do mean by a sign, it might soon be resolved. But that is not the point. We are in the situation of a zoologist who wants to know what ought to be the meaning of fish in order to make fishes one of the great classes of vertebrates. Peirce then wishes to construct a concept of sign that would, like the zoologist's concept of fish, represent a real and not merely conventional grouping of phenomena. And like the zoologist, Peirce is guided initially by the ordinary conception. The zoologist must look at what are ordinarily called fish to determine their underlying similarities before he can either include the species species not ordinarily called fish in the class of fishes, or exclude species, for example the various species of whale, that were conventionally included. Similarly, Peirce begins with an analysis of what we ordinarily call signs and then extends that term to phenomena not ordinarily called signs if they prove to be variations on the same basic principle. Peirce expresses this method in a variety of ways. In 1897, when he identifies logic in its general sense with semiotic, he defines the latter as the quasi-necessary or formal doctrine of signs. By describing the doctrine as quasi-necessary or formal, I mean that we observe the characters of such signs as we know, and from such an observation, by a process which I will not object to naming abstraction, we are led to statements eminently fallible, and therefore in one sense by no means necessary, as to what must be the characters of all signs used by a scientific intelligence, that is to say, by the intelligence capable of learning by experience. As is clear from his explanation of what he means by scientific intelligence, Peirce does not limit signs to what can affect human beings, for all sorts of creatures exhibit a capacity to learn from experience. In a later passage of 1903, Peirce expresses the same method of abstraction in another way. By a sign, I mean anything which conveys any definite notion of an object in any way. As such, conveyors of thought are familiarly known to us. Now I start with this familiar idea and make the best analysis I can of what is essential to a sign, and I define representamen as being whatever that analysis applies to. Even if my analysis is correct, something may happen to be true of all signs, while there might be something which my analysis describes of which the same thing is not true. In particular, all signs convey notions to human minds, but I know no reason why every representamen should do so. Here Peirce introduces the technical term representamen to express the generalized notion of a sign, restricting the word sign to its narrower ordinary application. This would make representamen not sign the key term in Peirce's semiotic. However, this was a rare and temporary usage. Peirce afterwards used sign in the generalized sense, as we can see from the passage quoted above, which occurs in a 1904 to Lady Welby. In this essay, I shall follow Peirce's more usual practice of using the word sign in the generalized technical sense he gave to it. Notice, by the way, that Peirce's analysis of signs, ordinarily so called, is in some respect mistaken, for we do speak of non-human animals as responding to signs, for example deer that sniff the air for signs of danger, and we also speak of signs that evoke action rather than thought, as in the case of a driver who automatically brakes his car upon seeing a stop sign. Peirce's genuine extinction of the concept of a sign is his application of it to human language and their use, for we do not ordinarily describe these as signs. For example, we do not call statements signs except when they signify something other than what is stated, as when a person saying "I am calm, very calm" is a sign that he is angry. Either way, the effect is to establish a single science of the conventional structures of human speech and of natural signs. It is a science both of human thinking and of animal behavior. I will comment on this at greater length later. Since Peirce's theory of signs is intended to be a science, it must be judged by the illumination it casts on diverse phenomena and by the fruitfulness of its application in research. It is not enough to judge the theory by the internal coherence of its basic principles. One must, in addition, give Peirce's detailed classification of science more attention than it has yet received, and one must refine and extend this classification wherever possible. Only in that way can we reveal the explanatory power and therefore the truth of Peirce's basic semiotic principles. All right. So, four pages. Only another 21 to go. Oh God. Peirce held that signification is the triadic relation. It is never a relation just between a sign and what the sign signifies, its object. A sign signifies only what it is capable of being interpreted as signifying. Hence, that which a sign is or would be interpreted, its interpretant, is the third relatum of signification. Peirce held that every sign has both an object and an interpretant. But just as an object is signifiable even when not signified, so also is a sign interpretable even when not interpreted. Therefore, while each sign must determine an interpretant, this interpretant not be more than potential. It is not necessary that the interpretant should exist. In being in futuro will suffice. Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking about something, you can look at a stop sign and not think about what the stop sign means. You can not interpret the stop sign as a stop sign. You may just see it as like a red octagon or whatever the stop sign looks like in your neighborhood. So, I mean, it doesn't need to be interpreted or understood as meaning stop. It can just be looked at and could possibly in the future mean stop to you. Okay. Notice, however, that something can be interpreted as a sign of something else, even when it is not a sign of that thing. Misinterpretation is possible. If the fanatic takes natural disasters to be signs of God's wrath, then we might say that they are signs to him of God's wrath. But it does not follow that we believe that they are signs of God's wrath. Hence, it is not in virtue of any possible interpretant that the sign signifies what it does. Rather, there must already be some relation between the sign and its object which determines or justifies a specific type of interpretant. Such an interpretant is, therefore, potential and not merely possible. You know, I don't know if this is possible, because we are like thinking that the thing that it should be interpreted as, that there's a distinct set of things out there that it should be interpreted as, seems kind of idealistic. Because if you think that, like, okay, so that like natural disasters are God's wrath, I mean, that isn't a crazy thought, because people thought that for a very long time. It seems unusual nowadays to think all of this, but I mean, if you're in the United States, this is pretty common, but maybe other places in the world it isn't. But like, people are constantly laughing at the homophobes who say that like God sends floods to gay people and then their house gets flooded. So like, this is not, and well, my point isn't like that, of course, that this might be a sign. It's that signs are signs to us, and I'm not so sure that you can make a obvious distinction that there are some rational and irrational interpretations, because that is sort of begging the question about like what might be a sign and what isn't. How do we know what all the possible ones are? But that's the point. A lot of these things are based on us. So I'm not sure that like this is actually separate from how we think about things. Like, so the fact that some people are crazy and think that like God's wrath is why like natural disasters happen, yeah, that's the point. It is tied to us, and we are not rational all the time. So it's like I'm not so sure that this is what's doing the justification over here. So like, its object which determines or justifies a specific type of interpretant. Really, is it the object, or is that an idealistic view of this, that it's the idea, the object itself, is somehow the way the world is? I don't know. Okay. That which would justify a certain type of interpretation of a sign is sometimes referred to as pers as a ground, though he usually refers to it simply as the relation of sign to object. The ground, of course, is not the only relation of a sign to its object, for a sign also signifies its object, and that is a different relation, albeit grounded in the other. It is in terms of the ground of significance that Peirce makes his most famous division of signs into icons, indices, and symbols. An icon is related to its object by resemblance, or if the object is a mere quality or type, by embodying or exemplifying it. Thus, if a piece of cloth is used as a color sample, then use is being made of it in its character as a sign of the color it embodies. An index is related to its object existentially, for example, by being an effect of it, as smoke is an effect of fire and therefore signifies the existence of a fire at the place from whence it arises. A symbol is related to its object by a rule to the effect that it is to be interpreted as signifying that object. The obvious example of symbols are the conventionally meaningful parts of human speech. The ground of a symbol is intrinsically semiotical, but those of icons and indices are not. In either case, we have to distinguish between the significance the ground determines and the ground itself. Significance is justified interpretability, while the ground is what justifies or determines this interpretability. The point is more obvious in the case of non-semiotical grounds. To say or think that X resembles or is causally related to Y is not to say or to think that X signifies Y, yet X does signify Y just if it does resemble or is causally related to Y. A less than triadic relation of X to Y might make X signify Y. Yet it does so only in relation to the possible interpretants that it would justify. Hence, significance remains essentially triadic even when it is grounded in dyadic or monadic relations. Alright, I'm not sure I got all of that, but basically I think it's just saying, look, you can have two things that signify each other, but like how it does it, you need some bridge, and that's the what the ground is providing is the method of signification, how to interpret. So, although the ground of a sign justifies certain interpretations of that sign, the ground is not infallible. Hence, some signs will be false, they will be real signs, but they will signify what is not. I mean, yeah, so you can have smoke, but there might not be fire. Now, why was there smoke if there's no fire? Well, the ground is off at that case. In this example, somehow the smoke existed without the ground of there being a flame. Like, the interpretation was wrong. But why? That's, yeah. So, thus, although grounded interpretations cannot be misrepresentations, since they are correctly apprehended they've correctly apprehended the significance of the sign, they can also be mistaken in another way, for they could fail to add a correction to a sign that is false. Yeah, so like if there's smoke but no fire, there could have been something else that caused smoke, like perhaps I don't know, some sort of like smoke machine. Okay, fever is a sign or symptom of an illness because most instances of fever are caused by illness. In the absence of information to the contrary, one properly infers illness from the fact of fever. If a feverish person turns out not to have even been ill, then our conclusion, though a grounded interpretation of the fever, will be mistaken. The distinctions hereby forced upon us are developed more systematically by Peirce in that part of his theory of signs that we will discuss below in section 4. Peirce's concept of a sign is extremely broad in several respects. First, something may be a sign even if it is not recognized as such. This, however, is consistent with ordinary usage when we speak of the discovery of meteorological indicators or of symptoms of diseases. Second, each physical object, process, or event is a great many different signs at once and may be seen by reflecting on iconic significance alone. Hence, while nothing is a sign of each other thing, each sign is a sign of many other things. I don't know what this sentence means. While nothing is a sign of each other thing, every other thing maybe. What? Hey, Sora, what's up? But yeah, sorry. Well, nothing is a sign of every other thing. Each thing is a sign of many other things. and there is nothing that is not a sign of something. Third, signs need not be only those things that are interpretable by thought, since some signs are interpretable by action, for example command, or by feeling, for example rebuke. This will be discussed in more detail in section 3. Fourth and last, a sign's potential interpretant need not be something that only a person would or could form. Even in ordinary speech, we refer to animals responding to signs in action, not in thought. Dogs obeying commands, deer warned of the approaching predator by a sound, predators' noses to the ground, following a spoor, and so on. Peirce's various definitions of sign vary greatly in breadth, but the method he described in the passages quoted above in section 1 indicate that it is the broadest definition which we should take most seriously. And this indication is strengthened by what he said in 1908 after having at that late date defined a sign in, let's see, wait, can I make this, whoa, that was massive. Let's zoom in. Why would it go to 400? Let's go to 300. Yeah, so I think that's right. Okay, now you can at least maybe see better. Alright, define a sign in one respect narrowly as anything which is so determined by something else, called its object, and so determines an effect upon a person, which effect I call its interpretant, that the latter is thereby immediately determined by the former. For this sentence is followed by another in which he says, my insertion of upon a person is a sop to Cerberus, because I despair of making my own broader conception understood. Yeah, so I mean doggos, Cerberus being the three-headed dog in Hades. Several authors have argued that on Peirce's view, some icons, indices are not really signs. Their reason is that symbols alone are related to their objects in an essentially triadic way, and that Peirce held signs to be prime examples of thirdness or triadicity. But this argument ignores the distinction between significance and the ground of significance. As I argued in the preceding section, a relation can be the ground of something's interpretability, even if that relation does not itself refer to any possible interpretation. Hence, icons and indices are still triadic, even though they are not grounded in triadic relations. I mean, yeah, if you have like an icon and it's like directly related to something else, like by definition, you can still like force it, I guess. The author here is basically saying, look, even if you have a dyadic one, you can force sort of the triadic onto it. It's not that hard to do. So like the ground of something's interpretability, even if it's given by definition and so it doesn't look like it has a third thing, the definition itself is acting as the third thing about how to relate one thing to the other. One might also object that icons can be more qualities or firsts, and that indices can be mere events or seconds, and hence that these cannot be signs if all signs are thirds. But this would be a failure to distinguish between a sign and what that sign is apart from its relation to its object and to its interpretant. Something's being a sign is constituted by an irreducibly triadic relation of it to an object and to an interpretant. It does not follow that this thing, apart from the relation that makes it a sign, is still a third. To deny that a component of an irreducibly triadic relation could be in itself something less than triadic is to commit the error that Peirce attributed to nominalistic schools, that maintaining that the whole alone is something and its components, however essential to it, are nothing. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of people that do this, that say, look, the whole is what's most important, and then the way you're breaking it down is kind of just like arbitrary. So that's what like the whole alone is something. This goes back to the ancient Greeks, of course. Parmenides comes to mind, I think it is, where you're talking about the wholes, and that's really what everything is. It's a holistic view, and then the components aren't real. But you know, everyone who says that has to still talk about it in some component way. You can't talk about the whole without talking about its parts in some sense. And so Peirce is like, look, you can talk that way, but no one actually thinks that way. You can't, there's nothing to be thought if you're only thinking about the wholes all the time. You have to talk about multiple things to actually think. And so you have to get yourself to an irreducible, you have to get yourself into a triadic relation at least. The, like, two usually isn't enough to get any real thought on. You need three things. Something of any category becomes a sign and therefore a third only in relation to two other things, specifically an object and an interpretant, actual or potential. Nothing is a sign in itself. It follows that if we are to understand what signs in Peirce's theory are, then we must examine the complete triadic relation of object, sign, and interpretant. But this relation consists in the potentiality something has for being interpreted as a sign of something else, and something's being so interpreted is the process which Peirce named Semeiosis. Therefore, Professor Max Frisch was surely right when he stated that the fundamental conception of semiotic is not that of sign but that of semiosis. The concept of sign must be explicated in terms of the concept of semiosis. But we have gotten ahead of the story, for what is the question that requires us to turn to the concept of semiosis for an answer? What is the difficulty we confront if we try to grasp the concept of sign without taking a sign's role in semiosis into account? That difficulty can be brought out in this way. Something is a sign only if there is something real or unreal that it signifies. But signifying is an odd sort of relation, if it is a relation at all. Just because what is signified need not be real. Physical relations obtain only when all of their relata exist. A brick cannot break a window, nor a boy stand on a bridge, unless brick and window, boy and bridge are real. But a sign can signify what does not exist. Brentano called phenomena of this sort intentional. Anything possessing intentionality has an object, is intentionally related to an object that need not be real. I'm actually thinking about intentional objects at the moment. These are just objects of thought. You can think of them as like imaginary things. So you can think of like Santa Claus. Now, there are many instances of Santa Claus in the world, but of course none of them are the actual one. It's Santa Claus itself is intentional because the like idea that there is a living magical being at the North Pole that makes toys for kids and delivers them all over the world in one night, that no one thinks that's actually real, but we can all keep that one thought in our mind. That is an intentional object that Santa Claus is then an intentional object that we all keep in. Like, it's all the same thought. Like, I don't think my idea of Santa Claus is like significantly different from yours, but like it's all, so it's, even though it's the same thought, it's like not real out in the world. It's just an intentional object of the same one that we all have. So it's a group delusion. Okay. It would seem then, continuing, that intentionality cannot be reduced to any purely physical relations. Yeah, I mean, there's, again, something in our head. Brentano himself held that intentionality was a characteristic unique to consciousness, and beyond saying that, he offered no analysis of intentionality. But if signs, including natural signs, do possess intentionality, then it is questionable whether intentionality always involves consciousness. And in any case, we confront the problem of accounting for intentionality of signs in virtue of what can something be said to signify something when what it signifies is not. And this is what my complaint was earlier, actually, that I was like, how are we doing this outside of people's heads? Like, I don't understand. And so that's why I was saying it was idealistic that signs were referring to things on their own outside of what we're doing, but this is the whole point. If we were talking about intentional objects are characteristics of unique to consciousness. That's the whole point of them, is that they're in someone or something's head, in their mind, like your mind's eye. You're thinking of like Santa Claus, but like you can have a sign of Santa Claus, but like again, what does the sign refer to if it's just a sign? Like, it can't be referring to some non-existent object. It can only be referring to, our idea of Santa Claus. So that is a bit of a weird position to be in, that the signs are referring to non-existent things, and that those non-existent things, like Santa Claus, have nothing to do with us, even though we made up Santa Claus. I'm sorry if I spoiled that for anyone. Our question can be answered and Brentano's position defended if we assume that all interpretants are thoughts. Okay, so we're just getting there through other means. All interpretants are thoughts. For them, we can argue that something S is a sign of an object O, if and only if it is capable of evoking a thought of O. So yeah, so it's still dependent on people. You just need to, it's just an extra step here. Okay. And since one can think of what does not exist, it follows that there can be signs of what does not exist. If the thought that is evoked or that is capable of being evoked by something S is a thought of something that happens to be unreal, then S is a sign of something unreal. In this way, the intentionality of signs turns out to be derivative from the intentionality of thought. Yeah, I mean, I was like, how are you gonna do this? But like, this is the thing: you can have like a sign of Santa Claus, like, you know, like a little a Santa icon or something on your on your phone or on Twitch or whatever, and then like that's really not that makes sense. But it's saying, well, the thing has intentionality because in interpreting the sign, it evokes thought. So basically, you're still sneaking in human intentionality, or at least intelligent thought that has imagination. Okay, but we've seen that Peirce denies both that all interpretants are thoughts and that they are all informed by or in persons. Okay, that was the problem. Besides, Peirce wished to analyze the human mind as a special case of semiosis rather than semiosis as a special application of... Well, wow, I'm losing it already. rather than semiosis as a special application of mind. He repeatedly described thoughts as signs and even portrayed man as being a sign. Therefore, if philosophy is coherent, Peirce must be able to account for the intentionality of signs without presupposing that of thought. Okay, there are ways to go here, but it gets more and more difficult. Let's see where Peirce goes, or this author says Peirce goes. Now, even though Peirce denies that all interpretants are thoughts, he might nevertheless maintain that all interpretants have intentionality, and that signs borrow their intentionality from their potential interpretants, just as they would on the preceding scheme. One way to do this would be to argue that every interpretant is a sign of the same object, that is, which the sign that which the sign interprets signifies. On that theory, a sign signifies that which would be signified by its potential interpretant. And until about 1906, Peirce did in fact hold that every interpretant is a sign of the object of the sign it interprets, though whether he held this view for the reason he suggested is open to doubt. I mean, this just seems circular at this point. It's like, okay, the sign is like connected to its potential interpretant, and so like the sign signifies that which would be signified by its interpretant. So you're basically saying the sign signifies the thing that it potentially interprets, or is determined by the interpretant, and the interpretant specifies what the sign signifies. So that doesn't seem like it's a very good theory, but whatever. Okay, but he didn't hold that apparently. But after 1906, he explicitly affirmed that there are some interpretants that do not signify the objects of the signs they interpret, or that if in some sense they do signify those objects, it is still not for that reason that they are interpretants. In any case, the pre-1906 theory could not account for the intentionality of signs. For, as William Alston points out, it assumes rather than explains their intentionality. Yeah, I mean, this is what the circularity would do. It would be an assumption of it. Or, as he puts it, their representative function. Yeah. We can explain the significance of each sign by referring to the significance of its interpretant, but this only pushes the problem ahead a step at a time, and in no general theory of significance can come of this. Yeah, I mean, this is just kicking the can. So, this is what's called kicking the can. You say, look, okay, what are we interpreting? Well, it's given. What does the sign signify? It's given by the interpretant. But then how does the interpretant interpret? It doesn't tell you. Just moves the goalpost. Okay, what Peirce said in 1906 is that the general mental signs may be, as well as have, logical interpretants, but they cannot be ultimate logical interpretants. The ultimate logical interpretant is a habit or change of habit, and this is not a sign in that way in which the sign of which it is the logical interpretant is the sign. It's a horrible sentence. Alston and several others suppose that interpretability by habit or habit change can account for the intentionality of signs. Again, habit seems like an act of an intelligent agent. So again, it's still tied to mind somehow. But Peirce holds that habits and changes in habits interpret some signs only. See section 4 below. Besides, it has not been made clear how such interpretation could account for the intentionality of any sign. It is not obvious that habits themselves possess intentionality. If we try to consider how they might, we always relate them, as I will argue in a moment, to a more complex context that is either explicitly or implicitly semiotical. And if habits gain their intentionality from their role in semiosis, then we cannot very well explain intentionality of semiosis by holding that it is derived from the intentionality of habits. Yeah, I mean, again, it would be circular. Oops. I propose that on Peirce's view, signs do not derive their intentionality from their interpretant, but rather that the intentionality of both signs and interpretant is due to the relation of one to the other. An interpretant has intentionality because it interprets a sign, and a sign has intentionality only in relation to its potential interpretations. Hence, it is to the semiotic process itself that we must look for an analysis of intentionality. Now, many authors have correctly drawn attention to Peirce's insistence on the irreducibly triadic character of semiosis, but there is only one passage in the collected papers in which Peirce discusses the triadicity of semiosis in any detail. This occurs in A Survey of Pragmaticism. In those two paragraphs, Peirce begins by distinguishing dyadic, dynamic or brute action from triadic, intelligent action. In dyadic action, an event A may by brute force produce an event B, and then the event B may in its turn produce a third event C. The fact that the event C is about to be produced by B has no influence at all upon the production of B by A. Such is dyadic action, which is so called because each step of it concerns a pair of objects. In the triadic production, and that's end quote. In the triadic production of B by A, however, the likelihood of B's leading to an event of some type C has an influence on whether A produces B. Quote, when a microscopist is in doubt whether a motion of an animalcule is guided by intelligence of however low order, the test he always used to apply is to ascertain whether an event A produces a second event B as a means to production of a third event C or not. That is, he asks whether B will be produced if it will produce or is likely to produce C in its turn, but will not be produced if it will not produce C in its turn nor is likely to do so. Okay, yeah, so it's like if someone is taking intermediate steps with the goal in mind to get to a better better outcome. So it's like if you a bird makes a tool to get like a treat or something, then you could say that B the bird produces a second event B, which is a hook on makes like a hook to get a food. Then you could say the idea is that there are the hook is more likely to produce C. So that's a sign of intelligence here. So guided by intelligence. If there's intermediate steps that don't have any use other than to bring about further steps, that's fine. Okay. As is clear from the example used, Peirce is speaking of intelligence in a sense far broader than that which would restrict it to the human variety. Yeah, I was talking about birds. Thus, the animalcule, I have no idea what an animalcule is, will not be required to be aware of the likelihood with which B would produce C. Intelligence will have been manifested if it is observed simply that an alteration in the frequency by which B's lead to C's results eventually in an alteration of the animalcule's tendency to produce B's. Yeah, I guess you could have something basically just probabilistically acting without even knowing it. So some sort of, I don't know what it would be, but you could say, look, it appears that something is doing something to attract a mate without actually being able to say that, it's thinking about it. It just does this, and that's how it attracts the mate by some dumb luck of making a certain sound, being near other of its species. Okay. If we look at the second example closely, we see that, contrary to what Peirce says, A cannot be an event that produces B directly. Either A is not an event, but it is the organism that produces or performs B as a means to C, or A is an event that stimulates the organism to produce or perform B as a means to C. For it is the organisms producing or performing B, perhaps possibly in response to some external stimulus, that is being described as intelligent, that is, as producing or doing one thing as a means to another. Notice that the production of C by B is not said to be triadic, it could be dyadic. It is only B which is said to occur as a means to something further, hence it is only the production of B by the organism A or by the organism in response to stimulus A that must be triadic. In short, it is that which is done as a means to something else that is produced triadically. If B is done as a means to C, it is B that is produced triadically, not C. The result aimed at might be produced dyadically. In an extreme case, it might be related to the means monadically, as when one does something of type B only because it is also of type C. I guess, but maybe. I mean, that seems weird. You still seem like you got a name change there, but still. Okay, but yeah, like the middle term is the one that has the like triadic relation. I mean, otherwise the A and the C are not, talking to each other. They go through B, and so B, of course, is the one with the middle term is the one that's triadic. The other ones are not. The author continues. Now, the major difficulty in understanding 5.473 properly consists in deciding how the A-B-C scheme applies to the sign situation. The obvious answer is that A is the object, B the sign, and C the interpretant, but it is almost always as obvious that this won't work. The apples being red does not cause me to say the apple is red as a means of getting you to think that it is red. The apple does not care what you think about it. However, A is not the object of the sign, B, but is an organism producing B, then we could suppose that A produces the sign B as a means of evoking the interpretant C. In fact, immediately after the passage quoted, Peirce offers the further example of an officer giving a command, which, as he points out, is clearly a case where a sign is produced in order to be interpreted. Thus, Fitzgerald suggests this reading of 5473. Quote, in saying that the interpretant is triadically produced, Peirce is claiming that the sign through which the interpretant is determined must be produced in view of the interpretant. The sign is useful because of its intended effect either on another or on the future self. So okay, now we've got signs that are created as they are interpreted, or because they are interpreted in a certain way. The author continues, but this would mean that every sign is, as spoken signs are, produced in order to be interpreted. All right, I just said that, which is, to say the least, dubious. Yeah, I mean, it seems that's not what actually happens. Natural signs are an obvious exception. Fire does not produce smoke in order to draw attention to itself. You see, this is why it's so weird that they were saying that these things inherently make an intentional object. Because you have to say things like natural signs. Like, does the smoke is that a natural indication of the fire, or is it only an indication to intelligent beings? Because it seems much more, like, no one's going to argue that an intelligent thing will know that smoke means fire. But to say that the smoke means fire on some sort of, without anyone to see it, that's like, does the tree fall in the forest? Does it make a sound? It's like one of these weird questions, like, what are you talking about at that point? Besides Fitzgerald's interpretation is inconsistent with what else Peirce says in 5.473. For later in the same paragraph he writes, it seems to me convenient to make the triadic production of the interpretant essential to a sign, but we have seen that whatever is produced triadically is produced as a means to an end. Hence, on Peirce's view, it is the interpretant that must be produced and as a means to an end and not necessarily the sign. Immediately after his discussion of the example of an officer giving a command, Peirce writes, however, although this condition, the triadic production of the sign, is most usually fulfilled, it is not essential to the action of a sign. We must conclude then that Peirce meant the example of giving a command as an example of a triadic production rather than as typical of sign production. What is essential to all semiosis, according to Peirce, is not the triadic production of signs, but the triadic production of their interpretants. Okay, it's like how we get to the meaning is triadic. So yeah, like the sign, object, and then so we've got the sign, we've got the object, and then how we make the bridge. That's like the head right in between. That is the thing in between us, I guess. Even though there's no mind there, it just has to be there somehow. Okay. As is clear from his description of triadic or intelligent action in 5473 as being the production of one thing as a means to another, Peirce regarded all triadic action as teleological, or in other words, as involving the influence of final causes. Yeah, so since you're taking out the mind, you have to again put in something else to cause these things to be related, and so now you're doing a theory of teleology, that there is some sort of structure to the universe that makes things the way they are. Semiosis is therefore an example of a teleological process. I have discussed Peirce's concept of final causation in another article. It will suffice here to say that, on Peirce's view, final causation does not in every case require consciousness. The end or final cause of a process need not be anyone's conscious purpose, but that nevertheless the fact of final causation is discoverable by empirical means, as is explained in the passage quoted above. Let us see now how this account of semiosis enables us to explain the intentionality of signs. In the remaining paragraphs of this section, I will be going beyond what Peirce himself actually wrote, as far as I know, though I believe that what I say is implicit in his theory. Yeah, so I guess the author here is going to regenerate a theory of like triadic relations on this teleological theory, where the teleology is the thing that's going to do the interpretation, or going to link the signs, their objects, and how we are to interpret them. And so we can discover the right sort of relation between things in the world, because it's teleologically given. Okay, excuse me. If A is a type of stimulus to which an organism regularly reacts by doing or producing B, and if we discover by observation that the organism does B as a means to achieving C, then we could conclude that A is a sign to the organism that the conditions are right for achieving C by doing B. The sign A, its interpretant is B, C is the goal of the process, in which forming B is one step, and the object signified to the organism by A is a complex propositional one, that the circumstances are right for achieving C by doing B. Within this complex object, it will usually be possible to identify some more specific non-propositional object, the presence or absence of which determines whether doing B will result in C. For example, if A is a chemical trace unevenly distributed in a solution that contains paramecium, and if the paramecium always turns to the side where it has found the trace to be strongest, and if this tends to lead it to food, then we could say that its movement B interprets A as a sign of food. Food then is the object O. C, the end, is either ingestion of food or nourishment or survival. Yeah, so this is like making some sense, because it's saying, look, if you look at the natural world, there is it's very easy to interpret things teleologically. So like that's goal oriented, basically, that like things want to live, and therefore you can discover the way things are organized biologically by this sort of thing. Now, expanding that thought to everything else is again an idealization, because living things generally, I mean, this is, the turn of the century. I'm sure Peirce knew about evolution. So the idea that like there's evolution and like things are oriented that way sort of to keep themselves alive, that's not shocking, and he would have known this. So, but I mean, to put that in the sense of like maybe are rocks governed teleologically, that would be kind of strange. Is astrophysics governed teleologically? I don't know how you can expand from the idea that like organisms are that way to say astrophysics. That doesn't make sense. Okay. In examples of the type cited, A could not be said to signify O, except by virtue of B's relation both to A and to C, or by virtue of potentiality for there being such a B so related to both A and to such a C. It is because B is done both in response to A and yet as a step in the process directed toward the goal C, and that B in effect interprets A as signifying something. Let's examine this idea in the context of another example. A deer hears a noise and flees danger. The deer's movement has its goal, safety. It is a flight from a supposed predator, yet this flight is elicited by a noise. Since the deer is fleeing a predator and not a noise, his flight, which was triggered by a noise, in effect interprets that noise as being the sign of a predator. This is not a substitution theory of signs according to which a sign takes the place of its object, not at all. For the noise is interpreted by the deer's behavior as a sign of danger just because that behavior is not a flight from the noise which evoked it, but is a flight from a supposed predator. Consider another example. A dog's cruel master raises his stick and the dog runs off. Is it the raised stick the dog flees? Is it not rather that the dog flees a beating? The raised stick signifies that a beating is in the offing. Yeah. I mean, it's very hard. Like, this is hard, but like, yes, when you understand something, it's the idea that you're like, is the raised stick what's more fundamental, or is the beating more fundamental? And then the idea that you're saying that the raising of the stick is not the beating to begin with, is that injecting a metaphysics there that shouldn't be there, saying, look, the stick is being raised. Well, that's from one point of view. From the point of view of the master and the dog, only the beating is in the offing. And so the idea that the raising of the stick is a sign, is that injecting extra metaphysics into just, there is a dog that's going to get beaten by some jerk. I mean, it's metaphysical questions about where do we get to pick and choose what objects exist in a scene. So, like, the idea that you're injecting the object of raised stick in a beating is from a certain perspective on, like, what is going on in the scene. There may not be, like, you might hear someone, like, they get into, like, they got into a fight. They said they don't even remember striking the person. They don't remember raising their hands. So this is the question. If you're having this sort of discussion about these relations, is this actually how people describe it, or is this from some sort of metaphysical point of view where you can break down these situations differently? And the idea that people sometimes say, I don't even remember striking the person, like, that is actually evidence against this sort of semiotic analysis, because there is no sign of there might not. Is saying that the sign is not fundamental to what's going on there, that the raised stick is not a fundamental part of the beating. It's just an analysis that's put on after the fact. So there is something to argue about at this point. Just because the action B is elicited by stimulus A but is directed towards goal C, it interprets A as signifying an object O, which, if it obtains, would make B a means for achieving C. And this is why I also don't do logic on stream, because this is the sort of thing that drives people, like, it's very hard to keep track of. And herein we also find an account of the intentionality of the sign B, for this object O need not obtain. Perhaps the master raised his stick only in order to scratch his back. The crash that startled the deer might not have been caused by a predator, and so on. Since we are able to explain in this way how something can be a sign of what does not exist, it follows that we have accounted for the intentionality of signs. See, this is the thing. The author has accounted for an account of intentionality of signs, given that there is certain actors that have a pre-existing relationship to things. These are, again, intelligent things that have goal-directed, like, people and, like, deer and dogs are, like, goal-directed things and are intelligent. So it's like, you've accounted for the intentionality of signs, but, like, again, this is we've already broken the thing down in a certain way as to give this account of the intentionality of signs. I'm not saying it's a bad way. This is not a bad way. It's a good way. But I'm just saying this is a certain metaphysical viewpoint on the world, that you can insert a raised stick into a beating, even though maybe that's not how you should be looking at what it is to, like, be in a fight. Like, just raising hands. As they say, look, of course, you can raise your hand to, like, scratch your back. But again, the raising of the hand has to be identified as something worth noticing. And otherwise, it's just like the guy's just, like, walking along. You didn't even notice him raising his hand. He did raise his hand, but you have to notice that for some reason. But that, again, is already injecting more information into the situation than you had before to say there was a specific act of raising the hand. This explanation of the intentionality of signs does not consist in deriving it from the intentionality of interpretants. For although B is done as a means to achieve C, and although B will be an effective means to C only if O obtains, still B cannot be said to be intentionally related to O except through its having been elicited by A. If this were not so, then we would be unable to explain why B did not occur until A occurred. Moreover, if we look at particular cases, we will see that it is always through the sign A that the object O is specified or located. When a noise causes a deer to flee, he does not just start running. Instead, he runs in some direction that is away from the place of the noise. Only because it is elicited by a definite sign A is an action B a response to some definite object O, but O can be real or unreal. Therefore, this goal-directed action is intentionally related to the object O. My point in this paragraph is that goal-directed action is intentionally related to an object only if it is also the interpretive sign of that object. One and the same analysis accounts for the intentionality both of signs and of their interpretants. Yeah, again, the middle term has to, the interpretant, what you're doing, like running away from a noise, you have to have like a goal-directed, like the sign of the way you're interpreting it has to do with the thing that you think it's a sign of, and the kind of noise, the kind of symbol that actually happened. So yeah, but again, this is intentionality based in terms of the way that the sign is being interpreted. Again, I don't see how this is getting away from it being mind or agent based. I mean, you can say it's not, but again, all these examples are using intelligent things, so whatever. Again, that's not a problem. I have no problem with it being like person based. Again, person maybe like this author wants it to be teleologically based, so there is something out there, even if there is no intelligent agent. I don't particularly care if there is or if there isn't. I don't think a whole lot's going to hang on it either. An obvious objection to what I've been saying so far is that this account is limited only to those interpretants which are actions. I will answer this objection by showing how this analysis can be generalized to apply also to other types of interpretants. But first, it is necessary to answer two other objections that will be made to this analysis, even as it is restricted to examples of the type already considered. First, is this account of semiosis consistent with our view that significance must always be grounded? The dog's departure is a grounded interpretation of the raised stick, since nearly all sticks that have been raised in that dog's neighborhood soon landed on his back when he delayed going. But most noises that startle deer are not produced by predators. Can we say that then the deer's flight is grounded? We can, for predators do sometimes create sudden noises. It is just that these noises are relatively unreliable signs of deer predators. They are grounded, but the ground does not determine a high degree of reliability. The cost to the deer of not fleeing predators in time accounts for their not waiting for more complete information when they hear a loud thump. Second, it will be objected that some of the behavior I have assumed to be goal-directed or intelligent really is not so by Peirce's empirical criterion, for that behavior does not exhibit the requisite self-correctiveness. The behavior of paramecia and even that of deer is largely instinctive, therefore exchanges in the probabilities with which B leads to C given A are not likely to affect the tendency of a deer or a paramecium to do B on the occasion of A. But this objection rests upon one's taking too narrow a view. Instincts are formed in the self-corrective process of evolution and are subject to correction in the further process of evolution. Intelligence, in Peirce's very broad view of it, is not limited to the careers of individuals, but is exhibited also in the evolution of species. Yeah, and so this is what I was saying. This is where the teleology, you can just get that in a more general sense for all naturally selected or evolutionary organisms that are undergoing evolution. Continuing, we turn now to the generalization of our analysis. As we see in section 4, Peirce admits interpretants of three types: energetic interpretants or actions, emotional interpretants or feelings, and logical interpretants, which are overtly verbal or are either thoughts or habits of action. So far we have spoken only of energetic interpretants, and our analysis seems inadequate as it stands even to account for all energetic interpretants, for it is not the case that all energetic interpretants are formed as a means to some goal. Consider, for example, the signs exchanged in a process of flirtation. A silly conversation keeps going, glances, body posture invite certain actions, and those actions, if performed, interpret those glances, etc., as invitations to so behave. But these actions are performed often, not always, for their own sake, for they appear to be energetic interpretants that are not the means to any further end, which is not to deny that they often have rather predictable consequences. However, why did these actions, performed for their own sake, need to be invited first? The answer is that the action performed would not have the desired quality if it was not welcomed by the other person. Hence, the question one faces in such a situation is whether an action of type B would also be of type C. It will be of type C if condition O obtains where O is a certain like-mindedness on the part of the other person, and the other person's glances, etc. are the sign A, which signifies that O does obtain. Thus, our analysis applies also to the case of this type. Actions performed for their own sake are goal-directed, only they are meant to be fulfillments of that goal rather than merely means to such fulfillment. If the action B and the goal is C, then B is an energetic interpretant of A if it is done in response to A. In that case, it interprets A as signifying something O, which would make B the fulfillment of the goal C. If you're doing like a mating dance and you're doing it to nobody, then it seems like you're not actually doing it to nobody. It seems like it's kind of pointless because you're trying to get the mate. But the idea is that when the mate is there, that sort of completes the triadic thing. Now you can do it anyway on the hopes that like it will somehow be seen. And so again, it's kind of like the deer being skittish. You just do it anyway because it's weakly correlated. You have to, throw a lot of crap at the wall and wait and see what sticks. Logical interpretants, too, may be either means to ends or ends in themselves. It is Evolve Yourself. My alerts are broken. What's up, Evolve Yourself TV? How is everyone doing tonight? Evolve Yourself, how are you doing? What's going on? If anyone here does not know Evolve Yourself, shout out Evolve Yourself. How you doing? You go click on, if you're not following Evolve Yourself, go click on the top of the little heart thing at the top of chat and give a follow of yourself a follow. He does usually meditations and chakra balancing on his stream, but sometimes other stuff too. He's a philosopher of mind, science, metaphysics, and all around good guy. Chess instructor. How was your stream? How's your stream, dude? What's going on? Yeah, I got tricked, I swear, into reading a very long paper on semiotics, on Peirce's simple theory of signs. So we're talking about like when A relates to B relates to C. That's what we're doing here. I should have known better, but I agreed to do it. So we're a little past halfway at this point, and we're just talking about how Peirce basically had this teleological view of the universe, and so all signs out there just had like some sort of independent relation of like what like a loud noise means danger under certain contexts, but like that's a objective fact. It doesn't have to do with like the organism being like possible prey to a predator. It's an objective fact that like a deer hears a noise and that noise represents that there is a predator there. Evolve Yourself says it went really well. We played chess, did a guided meditation, chakra balancing, readings from the Tao Te Ching, and readings from Grimm's fairy tales. That is a solid stream. That sounds like a very solid stream. So yeah. That's great stuff. What fairy tale are you reading anyway? Like, I remember that fairy tales, when you actually read them, are not so fairy tale-y. They're a little scary. So, sounds good. I could use some. Yeah, I gotta start getting back into shape. And you haven't read Peirce? Oh, Peirce may have been one of the more brilliant and underrated, or at least underappreciated philosophers. And so, it's like really like, I think one of the quotes I heard was that basically Peirce may have read every book on logic that was available in like the late 1800s. Like literally everything that could have been he could have read on it. He did read those books. He basically invented things in logic that people are still dealing with and discussing. So yeah, it was called The Cat and the Mouse in Partnership. Mouse doesn't look like it's gonna get the good end of that stick if you're in partnership with the cat. But yeah. So I think what we're up to now is saying how words are symbols that get us to act in certain ways. So what exactly, like the symbols that like you're dropping in chat, your chat and all the emotes, what are they symbolizing? And then they symbolize something that like some object out there that we're supposed to understand. So like the little heart symbols, for anyone who doesn't understand the theory here, is the heart symbols get me as the interpretant to understand that there's an object out there, which is the love that y'all have for, good streamers. So like we love Evolve Yourself, and so you put the heart symbol in chat, and then that causes us to recognize the love that we all have. So that's kind of the idea. So in some sense, the emotes are very much in this sort of semiotic, this symbol interpretive area. Evolver says Peirce was totally underappreciated. In fact, after he died, some other philosophers in his department burned some of his writings to heat the building. Wow, that's crazy that they burnt like his manuscripts. That's terrible. You'd think another philosopher would at least know better. But yeah. Yeah, he had a few friends in philosophy, and then he was out of philosophy academia for a long time, and so the idea that someone had his manuscripts and burned them, that's terrible. I know that people found his stuff later too, so. But yeah, it actually would be an interesting thing to do a semiotic analysis of the emotes, because there's definitely I forget linguist theory and other sort of theories on these things, but a semiotic analysis might be fun too. Anywho, I gotta keep going because I gotta keep moving on this because it's a long paper. I'm on page 15 here, and I gotta get myself all the way to page 25. So yeah. Okay. Logical interpretation. Yeah, and as always, anyone out there, feel free to ask questions along the way. So, this is my first time reading it, just trying to figure out what's going on. Logical interpretants, too, may be either means to ends or ends in themselves. It is easy to see in a rough way how overt speech, thoughts, and habits of action can be performed as means to ends, and how they thereby interpret various signs. The thought, funnel-shaped clouds portend tornadoes, and the habit of preparing for a tornado when funnel-shaped cloud is sighted have as their goal safety. Now, these thoughts and habits were formed either in consequence of what we were told or in consequence of what we have observed about funnel-shaped clouds. Thus, they interpret the statements made to us or the events observed by us as signs that a general correlation between funnel-shaped clouds and tornadoes does indeed obtain. For if such a general correlation did not obtain, these thoughts and habits would not subserve their goal. Of course, many of our thoughts and habits are directed to no specific goal, yet they can be viewed as serving the general purpose of knowing how to act in any contingency so as to achieve whatever goals we might have. I may never have occasion to act upon my belief that water expands when it freezes, but then again I may. And if I do, it will matter that water really does expand when it freezes. Hence, my belief interprets whatever instruction or experience produces it as being a reliable sign of the real behavior of water. Thoughts about particulars need to be mentioned here too. My thought that John is angry is not a general rule of action, either for actual or for hypothetical goals, yet it may occasion acting on such rules. And again, if so, the purpose of the action is not likely to require or to be achieved by acting in this way if John is not angry. Hence, the thought that he is interprets whatever produced it as being a reliable sign of John's real mental state. Yeah, so I was what is the... why do we do stuff? Well, it's because there's a real thing out there that we are interpreting, but there's only a symbol of that. You read someone's facial expression, but that is not the underlying anger. That is only a symbol of it. And so how do you interpret that? That's a logical interpretation of something that is not, is not energetic upon you. It's just you have to, reason about this. When a logical interpretant is formed for its own sake, then it must be formed as fulfilling some goal C. Now, what goal would that be? Well, the statements and beliefs we seek for their own sake tend to be those we think are important truths, important not for practical purposes, but as providing understanding. Thus, these statements and thoughts interpret what inspired them as reliable signs of the way things really are. To test such logical interpretants, we must interpret them in turn by habits of action, and then we must act upon these habits in action. In so doing, we will often be pursuing hypothetical goals that we really do not desire. We do it only in order to achieve our real goal, which is to possess true beliefs and avoid false ones. Such practice is for the sake of theory. It will be obvious to the reader that we are now in the middle of Peirce's pragmatism. There will be the occasion in section 4 to say more about the relation between Peirce's pragmatism and his theory of signs. Yeah, I mean, why are we doing stuff? For pragmatic reasons. But this is already giving us a structure to why we do stuff, because this is how we are. In some sense, not teleological, but we are already directed in a pragmatic way to do things that are useful for ourselves. Okay. Emotional interpretants may also be either means to ends or ends in themselves. One may be said to take in the significance of a rebuke only if he feels shamed by it, unless he can justify or excuse or disown that for which he is rebuked. But shame serves the purpose of moral reformation. It tends to make one reluctant to do that which he has done but should never do. Hence, to feel shame when rebuked is to recognize the genuine moral wrongness of that for which one is rebuked. And if one feels neither shame nor the need to justify, excuse, or disown, then he may be said not to have interpreted the rebuke as a rebuke. An exception to this would be a shameless person, in the extreme case a sociopath, who knows he is rebuked but cares not. But such people, it might be said, do not really apprehend the significance of the rebuke. Their understanding of it is wholly conventional, that the action for which they are rebuked is one of a type that people call wrong, and which people want to discourage others from doing. So sociopaths do not apprehend its wrongness themselves. Were they to do so, they would feel ashamed. Their feeling of shame would be that recognition. Yeah, I mean, if you don't interpret any of your emotions as like having meaning, and you're only doing stuff because people tell you to, then there's something wrong with you, because, well, not necessarily wrong with you, but there's something different about you than everybody else. And so if there's something different about you than everybody else, and I mean like everyone else, like there are lots of like subgroups of people, and like that's fine. But like if you're different in some really weird way where you never feel bad about anything because you've never done anything morally wrong, either you're a saint or you're like potentially a sociopath because you don't care what other people think. But the idea is that you can't use your own emotions as reasons for doing things, and that would be somewhat unusual for people. You have to be able to understand your emotions as either things why I'm doing something or why you're doing something, because people use their emotions in that way and they understand the world in that way. I gotta figure out why my alerts are so weird. Anyway. I enter here into controversial matters only in order to show one way in which emotional interpretants can be accommodated to our analysis of semiosis, and one way in which Peirce's semiotic might be applied to topics in moral psychology. If you are not convinced by this example, I hope you will nevertheless agree that it indicates how suggestive and potentially illuminating attempts to apply Peirce's semiotic would be. These same remarks pertain also to Peirce's favorite example of an emotional interpretant, the feeling produced by listening to a piece of music. I take this to be an emotional interpretant that is sought for its own sake. The feeling one seeks in listening to music is one that would be a full and proper appreciation of the piece. Thus, the feeling formed interprets the music as possessing those qualities that would make that feeling a full and proper appreciation. Of course, we often fail to achieve the right feeling. If we listen again, our appreciation deepens, or sometimes we find that the piece wears thin. In all such cases, the object signified seems to be a qualitative possibility embodied in the sign. Hence, much of music, and I would venture to say other forms of art, are iconic signs. Art is expressive, but what is expressed need not exist outside the work of art itself. And it seems like what you're trying to express there is like a kind of beauty that you just appreciate for its own sake. Now, saying that, it seems like this is actually a rather limited understanding of art. Like, you can just appreciate beauty, but this is only one sort of kind of thin understanding of it because it's opaque. You do not actually understand what's going on. You just say, oh, it's beautiful to me. And why is that? Well, I'm not sure. It just is there. And so this may not be wrong in terms of like how it does it. It just actually seems maybe a little flat on terms of how you actually understand music. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that aesthetics really is a latecomer as its own topic in philosophy. In fact, it's not been around except in, I think it was the late 1700s or the 1800s. They didn't even like, the word aesthetics didn't exist. Like, no one thought of art for art's sake. So when Peirce was writing this may have been cutting edge philosophy in terms of aesthetics. I don't think this is now, but like, going back to the time when he was writing this stuff, this may have been like cutting edge aesthetic theory. But like, I think to me it's falling a little flat in terms of like understanding aesthetics. But like, this may have been like sort of the like really a avant-garde view of things back in the day when this was being written, which is kind of fun. But like, I just think it just feels old right now because you can't talk about beauty except in this sort of old-fashioned, oh, there's just beauty in this piece of work. Okay. 4. Objects and interpretants. We have already encountered the emotional, energetic, logical trichotomy of interpretants, according to which an interpretant may be either a feeling, an action, or something of the nature of a law, such as a word, statement, concept, belief, or habit. While some signs have emotional interpretant only, or an energetic but not a logical interpretant, it appears to have been Peirce's view that every logical interpretant incorporates one that is energetic, and that every energetic interpretant incorporates one that is emotional. In addition to this trichotomy, Peirce introduced another division of interpretants into the immediate, the dynamic, and the final. It has usually been thought that the two trichotomies were meant to be synonymous, but in fact they are entirely different. In a letter of 1909 to Lady Welby, Peirce wrote, "My immediate interpretant is implied in the fact that each sign must have its peculiar interpretability before it gets an interpreter. My dynamic interpretant is that which is experienced in each act of interpretation and is different in each from that of any other, and the final interpretant is the one interpretive result to which every interpreter is destined to come if the sign is sufficiently considered. The immediate interpretant is an abstraction consisting in a possibility. The dynamic interpretant is a single actual event. The final interpretant is that toward which the actual ends." Okay, I mean, I think I have an idea what they're saying. It's basically like everyone has their own sense of things. So everyone has their own sense of the world. And so even though you have a different, like, your sense, that like everything hits you different than it hits me, but like that doesn't mean you can't interpret the sign in the same way. So like, yeah, your view of a stop sign and my view of a stop sign are coming in from slightly different angles, but we're both seeing sort of like the same sign, even though, what's it called? That would be the, so like the immediate is the stop sign because it's like that sign has its particular interpretability because it's that stop sign. The dynamic is the difference between me and you, and then the object is, of course, to stop. Now that possibility in which the interpretability of a sign consists could be either a possible feeling, a possible act, or a possible thought. And in fact, the interpretability of many signs could not just consist in a feeling or possible feeling. A command, for example, is primarily interpretable by an act, that is, by an act of a given type. Therefore, the interpretability or immediate interpretant of a command is a possible action. Similarly, those interpretants that are actually formed may be either feelings, actions, or words, thoughts, or habits. It is true that a feeling in itself is something less than an actuality, while a law or habit is more than any set of actualities. Nevertheless, feelings do actually occur, and habits and certain other laws do come to be formed, modified, or destroyed. Therefore, a dynamic interpretant can be emotional or logical and need not in every case be energetic. Similarly, the final interpretant toward which the dynamic interpretations of a sign tend could, depending on the sign and goal of interpretation, be either the feeling or action or the thought which would be the ideally adequate interpretation. Thus, the two trichotomies intersect, yielding 9 distinct types of interpretant. Yeah, so you can have like everything is like the way it hits you, the way it immediately is like on in the world, all this stuff. So you can like mix and match of these things. It is worthwhile to consider the immediate dynamic final trichotomy in more detail. The immediate interpretant, per says, is implicated in the interpretability of a sign. It is that element which must be present in any interpretant of that sign. Of course, the same thing may be different signs, and so there need be no element in common to all interpretations of it. Since a sign need not be actually interpreted, the immediate interpretant can remain unactualized possibility. Yeah, you can see a stop sign and not realize it's a stop sign. You can just see it. And actualized or not, the immediate interpretant is a possibility only, for any actualization of it is a dynamic interpretant. Yeah, once you start thinking about the thing as a stop sign, then you are dynamically interpreting the sign that is the stop sign, even if you hadn't previously thought of the stop sign as a stop sign. This does not mean that there actually are no immediate interpretants. On the contrary, just as there actually are possibilities, actualized or not, so also there are immediate interpretants, indeed one per sign. The immediate interpretant, like any possibility, is vague and can be actualized in diverse ways. Yeah, like so the way the sign hits you, you can actually interpret that differently. Hence, the dynamic interpreter of a sign, if any, is always more than just an actualization of the immediate interpretant. At the very least, it actualizes in a particular way, to which there are any number of alternatives. But as we will see in more detail below, the dynamic interpretant can also add to the immediate interpretant, and this also in any variety of different ways. Signs of certain types are able to acquire numerous dynamic interpretants, each differing from each of the others. The final interpretant, like the immediate, is unique for each sign, and like the immediate, it need not be actualized. Yeah, because a stop sign is telling you to stop there, not where all the other stop signs are. But while a dynamic interpretant can fail to actualize the immediate interpretant of the sign in question, it can and usually will fail to actualize the final interpretant. The final interpretant is only what a dynamic interpretant of the sign would be if it were formed when the sign was sufficiently considered. Yeah, so like when you see a stop sign, it's not telling you to stop anywhere. It's telling you to stop at that point where that stop sign wants you to stop, and that's what you need to sufficiently consider it. It's not just seeing a red octagon. It's not just seeing a red octagon in a certain way. It's when you see seeing it as a stop sign, it's seeing it as a stop sign in that place doing a certain thing. In this trichotomy of interpretants, we find verification for two views advanced above. First, the idea of an immediate interpretant presupposes that of a ground of interpretation. The significance of a sign is its immediate interpretant, and this is its grounded interpretability, which the sign possesses regardless of whether it is actually interpreted. Second, the idea of a final interpretant presupposes that of a goal of interpretation. For apart from such a goal, consideration of a sign would not lead to the interpreter to any destined conclusion. Regardless of the amount of consideration made, any conclusion would remain just as good. But if each sign has a unique final interpretant, then each is the sign that it is in relation not only to a ground but also to a goal of interpretation. It is clear then that Peirce conceived of semiosis as a teleological process of signs as being what their potential role in semiosis makes them to be. Yeah, so this whole thing, you have to take it all together because that's what the sign's doing. It assumes that you're in this relation with them, understanding the stopping at a stop sign. Again, this is an idealism right here. It's a teleological idealism because we are in this relation with the signs and that it somehow exists independently of us. But that's okay. It's just like this is the Peirce's idealism, I guess. Yeah. Because everything has a unique final interpretant and that's supposed to be independent of us. But I don't know how it actually is because stop signs really affect us, but like this is for all things, all places. And so maybe he's conceiving of this as a natural thing in some sense. There is a way to view the world. He's a very realistic sort of theory here. Like there is the correct way to interpret nature. And the idea that there is a correct way to interpret nature relies on like a teleological theory, that there is some sort of grand structure to it. Yeah, so I mean, if you want to consider grand structures that the whoa, zoom. Why does it do that? Let's go back to 250. 300 then. Yeah, there we go. So the idea that like you can interpret the way the world is or your body is, like there is a right way to do it. That's the teleological thing. If anyone has any questions about this, let me know. I'm trying to break it down because I know there's a lot of like A, B's, and C's in this paper, and it gets a little hard to keep track of. Okay. If one interpretation of a sign can better serve the goal of interpretation than another, that must be because there are conditions distinct from the sign itself that make one interpretation better than the other. Either interpretant would embody the immediate interpretant of the sign, but they would add to or qualify the immediate interpretant in different ways, and the one way of doing this would result in a closer approximation to the final interpretant than would the other. Thus, Peirce distinguishes between the immediate and the dynamic objects of a sign. The immediate object is the world or some part of it, as a sign represents it to be, while the dynamic object is the world or the relevant portion of it that will actually determine the success or failure of any given interpretant of the sign. I mean, there's a lot of world here. I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. All the things in the world determine on how you are locating in on the actual meaning or the correct interpretation of a sign, like a stop sign to say stop here if you're going this way. This success or failure will sometimes be manifest in the semiotic process itself, namely when there is opportunity to form more than one dynamic interpretant of the same sign, for then each interpretant implicitly adds or corrects the preceding interpretant. But such a process presupposes that we have some access to the dynamic object independent of what the sign itself signifies about. Peirce is thus led to a further distinction between acquaintance with the system of signs and collateral observation of the dynamic object. Yeah, I mean, you can imagine that like there could be ambiguous signs out there, and so you could be thinking of signs and like something going on in like two different ways. You'd be like, oh, I didn't realize that this sign here means something different than what I thought it meant. And so you need to be acquainted with the proper understanding of a sign in a certain area, because it, it could have two meanings. Like the word bank, it could be the place where you have your money versus like the side of a river. And then of course, if you see the word like the bank is up ahead, you could mistake what the sign is trying to tell you. By a system to which a given sign belongs, Peirce could only mean the ground of the sign's significance plus the correlative goal of interpretation. This would be a system linking one sign to another only in certain cases. Acquaintance must include having the relevant aim or goal as well as having an ability, not necessarily involving conscious knowledge of the ground, to respond to signs of the given type on the basis of their ground. Such acquaintance, Peirce says, is all that is necessary to apprehend the sign as such, that is, to form a dynamic interpretant of it, in which perforce its immediate interpretant is actualized. And in the immediate interpretant of the sign, its immediate object is apprehended or responded to or felt. For the immediate object is the object of the sign as the sign represents it to be. The immediate object and the immediate interpretant are two sides of one coin, or rather of one sign. The dynamic object, by contrast, is that which from the nature of things the sign cannot express, which it can only indicate and leave the interpreter to find out by collateral experience. Yeah, I mean, what actually is there? Is it the side of a river, or is it the financial institution? The sign indicates its dynamic object by directing the interpreter toward that sort of experience, which would count as observation of that object. Peirce illustrates this effectively at length in an unpublished manuscript of 1906. As he there formulates the point, though a sign cannot express its object, it may describe or otherwise indicate the kind of collateral observation by which that object is to be found. So like, yeah, if you have a sign that go up and left to go to the bank, I mean, it's telling you in some sense how to go about interpreting what it means and how to go about that. Collateral observation will result in dynamic interpretants that actualize the immediate interpretant, not just in a randomly selected specific way, but in a specific way that is to a greater or lesser degree dictated by collateral observations, sometimes with additions or even corrections. Thus, though not presented by the sign, the dynamic object is effective through the mediation of the sign in determining interpretants more or less adequate to itself, given the goal of interpretation. The dynamic object is the really efficient but not immediately present object. Yeah, I mean, so basically, people looking for the bank will understand what the sign means. So, like, that's the really efficient object. That's the one doing the work, but, like, it's not the one that's immediately present. So that's why the sign's there, because there is a bank that people want to get to, whichever one that happens to be. Let us consider 3 illustrations of the process just described. First, several physicians consulting can agree that a thermometer reading indicates that the patient has a fever, while disagreeing about what else this signifies. The immediate logical interpretant is that the patient has a fever. What their dynamic interpretants add to this will depend upon their collateral observations of the patient, of similar cases, and so on. The immediate object of the sign is fever. The dynamic object is the actual physical condition of the patient so far as that bears on the physician's practical problem, for their goal is only practical, not theoretical. Sufficient collateral observation will produce dynamic interpretants close to the final logical interpretant, in which this dynamic object would be fully apprehended. Yeah, so the more you learn about the subject, the more you understand what kind of disease they have, and so that gives you more information about the fever, but you understand that the fever is related to something going wrong in someone's body, and then you can try to correct that thing based on more information. And of course, people have different histories, and they'll understand the symptoms differently, and the symptoms being the signs. Second, Peirce wrote that the dynamic object of a command is the will of the commander. This has been misunderstood as referring to a psychological state. Yeah, this is so interesting that he's so anti-psychological about this. Instead, it is what the commander wills that is a type of action. The immediate object is the type of action expressly commanded, and this will often be less specific than the type intended. An infantry officer who shouts, "Charge!" will want his men not only to charge, but to take advantage of all available cover, etc. In order to match their actions to this dynamic object, the soldiers will have to understand from their training that charge means more than just charging, and they will have to make collateral observations of the terrain, the disposition of the enemy, etc. When the commanded share the goals of their commander, then the final interpretant is energetic, and normally, that is, when the commander makes no mistake, it is that action which would fulfill the dynamic object more nearly than would any alternative. Yeah, like this is what I was saying about the stop sign. A stop sign it says stop, but it doesn't mean like stop over here. It means stop when you get to the stop sign. You have to understand that the stop has specific conditions on it, even though it doesn't specify that. And that's the same thing about this. Like, this command is you charge. It's not just to run willy-nilly. It's to like go forward in a militaristic way. Third, art is in many ways a limiting case for semiotic analysis. If the object of a piece of pure music is the feeling or musical idea it embodies, then there can be no difference between its immediate and dynamic object. Yet there is such a distinction with respect to the music as it first presents itself to us. It may take several hearings for one to discover that a passage which seemed sweet is really insipid, or that a passage which at first sounded only complex is in fact quite moving. Thus, successive dynamic emotional interpretants may progress from a vague feeling corresponding to the pretensions of the piece to a definite feeling corresponding to its reality. This progress is not determined by collateral observations, but by closer attention to the sign itself. I mean, why are we saying no? I just disagree with this. Collateral observations would be closer listenings to the maybe the actual recording or the playing of it. The sign itself of the whole music, I'm not so sure, because there's still going to be collateral observations. Actually, no, the author's right here. I'm wrong. The collateral observations are, well, I don't know. Like, if you're trying to figure out the sickness of a person, you could learn lots of things about the person. If you're trying to learn something about the music, you listen to different parts of the music. I guess that's closer attention to the sign itself. So the author has it right, not me. Yeah. But like exactly what is it to again, this was one of my earlier gripes is what is it to listen to the music? Are you listening to the pauses in the music, like the spacing, and what exactly counts as the music in itself in this case? This is what I was talking about earlier about like a man who raises a stick to beat a dog. Now, we define the stick raising as an object. The man may not even remember raising his hand. And so how we may be adding more information to this, and that's kind of again, this is bringing up the same issue here. What exactly is the analysis of the music? Like, are we adding anything to it with our ideas? Yeah, but I don't know. But you can see why, like, if there is some sort of, this is why I keep calling it idealistic. If there is a if this is all teleologically determined, that it's outside of ourselves, it isn't actually depending on how we interpret it, then it is just, that is what the thing is to understand the music in that way. And so, yeah, and that's just what it is. You just pay closer attention to the thing itself, because that's what the thing is. It is this interpretation in that we give to it, or no, that we're doing with it. Not giving to it, that we are doing with it, the semiotic. Okay. One of the criticisms of Peirce's semiotic most often made is that he was mistaken in holding that every sign has an object. On a windless day, a weather vane still points, but there is no wind direction that signifies. Unicorn refers to nothing real, and so on. But each sign signifies something, real or unreal, and that is the immediate object. Peirce is not committed to any ontological claims about the immediate object. He does not say that in every case, it exists independently of the sign. So each sign, to be a sign, has at least an immediate object. But if we can question whether this immediate object is real, then that is because the sign itself indicates where or how, if anywhere or anyhow, that reality is to be found. This is the dynamic object that is independent of the sign. The dynamic object of the weather vane is the velocity of the circumambient air, that is, that of unicorn is the world insofar as it may or may not be qualified by the inclusion of unicorns. It is by collateral observation of these dynamic objects that we discover that there is nothing in them that answers to the immediate object of the sign. Therefore, we see how each sign has both a dynamic and an immediate object. As with the example of music, the two objects of an iconic sign tend to be identical and embodied possibility. Yeah, so yeah, things can be symbols of stuff that aren't really there. That's fine. And so Peirce has this distinction. That's okay. That's fine. But like talking about non-existent objects is always very difficult. And so the fact that he has to sort of make an odd way of talking about it is pretty normal for this area, at least of philosophy. Okay. Our examples will have made it obvious that just as the immediate object and immediate interpretant are correlative, so are the dynamic object and the final interpretant. The nature of the correlation depends on the system to which the sign belongs. For example, in the case of commands, the final interpretant is energetic and fulfills the dynamic object, whereas in the case of disinterested inquiry, the final interpretant is logical and is, or can be, vita infra, itself a sign in which the dynamic object is fully and accurately represented. It seems to be the latter type of semiosis that Peirce had exclusively in mind when he wrote too narrowly that the dynamic object is the object as it is, regardless of any particular aspect of it, the object in such relations as unlimited and final study would show it to be. Yeah, I mean, if you're doing math and you have an answer you need to get, that would be the final object, even if, like, in the idea. And so it would, like, the study would show it to be. But, like, of course, you can get there in using different ways and different thoughts and different methods. But, like, if it's math, there's an answer. But, like, that's going to be a limited thing. But that's what I think the author means here. Like, when he's talking logically about stuff. Yeah, so, and the final interpretant as that which would finally be decided to be the true interpretation. In the case of disinterested inquiry, but in that case only, the final interpretant is what Peirce elsewhere names the final opinion, and the dynamic object is that reality which is represented in the final opinion. Peirce's theory of inquiry is a part of his general theory of signs. Okay. Finally getting towards the end. We got 3 more pages basically. Peirce's pragmatism is part of his theory of inquiry, hence it too belongs to his semiotic. It is in fact the doctrine of the ultimate logical interpretant. As far as I know, commentators on Peirce's philosophy have never distinguished the ultimate from the final interpretant. However, they are entirely different in conception. There are final interpretants of the logical, the energetic, and the emotional varieties, but the distinction between the ultimate and non-ultimate applies only to the logical interpretants. A non-ultimate logical interpretant is verbal. Either it is an overt utterance or inscription, or it is a thought. For Peirce, like Plato, conceived of thoughts as internalized discourse, but a verbal interpretant is another sign of that dynamic object, which is the sign it interprets. It interprets signifies. Oh, it interprets signifies? Okay. Therefore, it too needs to be interpreted, and it cannot be fully interpreted by an action or feeling that is by anything less than a logical interpretant. It follows that if all logical interpretants are verbal, then each logical interpretant would determine a further logical interpretant ad infinitum, and then we would be unable to account for the intentionality or significance of any sign that must be interpreted logically. The argument for this is the one we made above in section 3. It is for this reason that Peirce sought a logical interpretant that was not verbal. In an unpublished manuscript of 1906, Peirce wrote, "Far from holding that a sign can be the naked, that is, the ultimate meaning of a sign, I was just about to insist that it cannot be so. And the great enigma that leads up to pragmatism, at least to my form of the doctrine, is, what can this naked or ultimate meaning be?" Peirce's answer is the pragmatic theory of meaning, according to which the ultimate logical interpretant is a habit or habit change. Quote, "I do not deny that a concept or general mental sign may be a logical interpretant, only it cannot be the ultimate logical interpretant, precisely because being a sign it has a logical interpretant. It partakes somewhat of the nature of a verbal definition and is very inferior to the living definition that grows up in the habit. Consequently, the most perfect account we can give of a concept will consist in a description of the habit that it will produce. That is the variety of pragmatism that I have urged." I think this does make sense, actually. The idea is that if it's just an analytic truth, that is not going to affect your life. If it is a real truth, then it will affect your life. And that is what's important in all this stuff. So all these signs, all these like analytic, like truths of like logic, they don't matter. That's kind of what's happening here. It only matters if you are going to change the way you live, to change your habits out of this. And that's basically it. Because all these signs and all the sort of machinations of thought don't matter unless it sort of changes your overall way you do things in life. And so that's what the pragmatic theory is that it has to actually come down to something you're doing. Like there has to be a lived effect of this. And so the idea that like you're going to use logic to just get an answer, like if I say 2 + 3 is 5, well, that's great, but that affects nothing I do. But if I learn some sort of like, but when I learned how to do math, that did affect my habits going forward, and that had some real meaning to me because it affected my habits going forward when I did learn how to add. And so, and this is sort of extrapolating on that. All your just sort of thoughts and stuff don't really matter until you actually put them into practice in your life. And that's the pragmatic theory. It has to have a pragmatic end to it, that you are doing something. And this is something I basically subscribe to, is that if you're just getting answers like analytically, you're not really doing a whole lot. It has to, have at least change the way you talk about things. If you're not even changing the way you speak about stuff, what are you you haven't learned anything, you haven't done anything. And so like I can change, like I can correct myself if I think I'm saying something stupid, but like if I don't force myself to change the whole way I talk, have I really learned anything? So okay, continuing. A habit can be tested by acting on it. Read a super section 3. Therefore, the ultimate form of a logical interpretant is the testable form of that interpretant. The final logical interpretant is the logical interpretant that would survive all possible tests. Not all ultimate interpretants will prove to be final, and the final logical interpretant need not be ultimate. However, if it is not the ultimate, it must nevertheless be translatable into an ultimate form. It is tested in its ultimate form, but it is enjoyed in its verbal form as a true representation of reality. I wonder what this would sort of look like. Is this like a paradox or something? Like you have to act in a certain way because like you have like the paradox and like you understand that if you do this, like it screws with you, but like so that's how like it is. It's like you have to avoid that at all cost. You have to avoid saying contradictory things, and so you don't say I'm lying right now. Maybe, but like that's kind of a very toy example. But if you're gonna do like paradoxy things, like sure. But there's a line from Wittgenstein. If Evolve Yourself, you're still here, maybe you'll appreciate this. Wittgenstein says at one point there'd be no sense to saying a first person believed wrongly. Like I am currently believing wrongly something. So there can't be a verb like that. And this is the sort of thing like that this would be, is that when you get a sentence like that, that's clearly a verbal sign. That sentence, like to have a verb to like the first person, I am believing wrongly. Like you could say I believe something wrong in the past and I'll get something wrong in the future, of course. But if you were saying I am currently believing wrongly, that would be something that we like just wouldn't say, and so we never even made up a word for that. And so there may be other things like this that once we understand them, we have to avoid them. Something similar to that sort of thing. The teleological character of semiosis requires that interpretants be testable. Hence, Peirce's conception of semiosis as teleological requires and explains his pragmatic theory of the ultimate logical interpretant. Conversely, Peirce's pragmatism is further evidence in favor of the view that he conceived of semiosis or sign interpretation as teleological in character. I mean, I just gave some examples that didn't require teleology, actually. It just required some sort of goal-oriented for us, not some grand structure of the universe. So, if you didn't have examples like I was going to give, then yeah, you might have to find some sort of way the world is to change to be more like that part of the world. But I just gave some examples where you don't actually need some grand scheme. But maybe like the idea here was that the whole of the world is like this, and we're just trying to discover more and more of these things to get more aligned with how the world is. Oh no, frames. I'm sorry if frames dropped. It looks like my connection went down for a sec. Anywho. Alright, last page. Mind and nature. I began saying that I hope to show that Peirce's semiotic is both coherent and intellectually fruitful. We have barely begun the latter task. Yet we have already found reason to suppose that Peirce's theory of inquiry and his pragmatism fit within and are explained or justified by his theory of signs, and some suggestions have been made about how Peirce's semiotic applies to practical investigations, to animal behavior, to rebukes, to commands, and to music. The real test of Peirce's theory would be a much more extensive attempt to apply it, guided by his detailed classification of signs. There is, however, one further subject illuminated by Peirce's semiotic which we can consider now. Peirce's concept of semiosis is so broad as to include a variety of processes that we recognize as natural. Much of animal behavior consists in sign interpretation. On Brentano's view, especially as that has been developed by Roderick Chisholm, the intentionality of signs is due to their evoking or being capable of evoking conscious thought of the objects signified. That is implausible as an account of signs responded to by relatively simple organisms, and even human beings often respond to signs in an unthinking way. Besides, this Brentano-Chisholm view in effect separates mind from nature. It makes all intentionality to be derivable from consciousness and makes consciousness in an unanalyzable datum radically different from the physical and biological processes studied in the natural sciences. On Peirce's view, as I understand it, intentionality and significance do not depend on conscious thought. Instead, while remaining irreducible to merely mechanical processes, that is, those in principle irreversible, intentionality and semiosis occur throughout nature. Conscious thought or internalized discourse is but a special case of semiosis. Okay, so he's a panpsychism. Yeah. Peirce distinguished human mentality from other self-corrective or intelligent processes by its higher degree of self-correctiveness. This, he suggests, consists in our ability to devise symbols by which to represent our habits of action or controlling principles to ourselves, whence they can be subjected to deliberate criticism and modification. It follows that the human mind, in no more than an especially complicated type of semiosis, involving the goal-directed creation and manipulation of signs as well as their goal-directed interpretation. But even such signs, symbols, and more generally legi signs, together with their replicas, occur also in lower forms of life, though here, for example, in the dance of bees, though manipulated, they are not created within the lifetime of an individual. Not all symbols and legi signs are conventional. Peirce's theory of signs thereby exhibits the continuity of the human mind with the rest of nature. Conversely, this theory shows us how natural processes have more mentality in them than is usually realized. In short, Peirce's semiotic reveals the place of man in nature. I hope you're happy, Cinesemiotics. That took 2 hours. Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, I'm interested in Peirce, so I found this kind of interesting. It's like, I think it's a good paper. It's just very, very in the weeds in doing Peirce's theory of semiotic. This last bit at the end, I mean, I could have taken it or left it. Like, it's interesting that, you know, he has a panpsychist view, which I guess might go with the teleology of the overall arching teleological view of the universe, and that like there's thought everywhere, and it's just the thought exists in how the world sort of relates to itself through the semiotic. But like, you know, this is like the last this last bit here is a little excessive. In short, Peirce's reveals the place of man in nature. It's like, well, okay, but I mean, once you're just doing this, it's like, yeah, well, everything's already teleologically organized, and so there will always be a place of man in nature in a organized system. But like, it sounds grandiose. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't mind doing another paper after this, as long as it is short as hell. But yeah,